Welcome to episode 204 of the Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Sam Tatam, author of the brand new book, Evolutionary Ideas. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. Today, I am so excited to introduce you to Sam Tatam to talk about his fantastic new book, Evolutionary Ideas. And yes, that's evolutionary, not revolutionary, though it is both. I got my first peek at this book so many months ago, and I have been eagerly awaiting the moment when I can finally share it with everyone. And I am delighted that that day is finally here. A little bit about Sam. He is global head of behavioral science at Ogilvy. He has a passion for understanding human behavior, and his experience comes from a mix of organizational and industrial psychology along with advertising strategy. Sam has led behavior change projects across virtually every category and continent. Today, he leads a global team of talented psychologists and behavioral economists to develop interventions and shape the communications of some of the world's most influential brands and organizations. Like I said, you're in for a treat. One quick housekeeping item before we jump into the interview. I want to be sure you know there are show notes for this episode with links to all sorts of related content, including past episodes, ways to get Sam's book and others related to our conversation, articles, and more within the show notes for the episode, which are waiting for you within the app you're listening to or at thebrainybusiness.com/204. Those already on the Brainy Business list got a direct link from me in the email you receive every Friday. Not on the list yet? Simply sign up for any freebie at thebrainybusiness.com and you'll be automatically added. The freebie for this episode is the first chapter of my award-winning book, What Your Customer Wants and Can't Tell You. And if you already have the book, in which case, thank you. You'll also be automatically added to the list when you get your copy of the free PDF companion workbook. Both are housed in our free behavioral economics community called the Be Thoughtful Revolution. There's a link to join that global community in those show notes as well. Now let's get right to it. Sam Tatam, welcome to the Brainy Business Podcast.
Melinda, thanks so much for having me.
Yes, as you know, I'm very excited for you to be here. I always have a little chat at the beginning and definitely could have become victim to spending all of our time talking and not recording. So excited to have you here. For everyone who does not yet know you, can you tell a little bit about your background and how you got into this amazing world of behavioral science?
Of course. Thanks so much. So in my background, I'm an organizational psychologist in my training, and I've moved into advertising and more broadly advertising strategy. And now I lead Ogilvy's behavioral science capability. So we have a behavioral science team that's growing across the globe. And I've been leading that for the last sort of 4 or 5 years.
I love it. And you've been for the UK team. You spent some time in Australia, I believe. Have you worked in any other areas for Ogilvy?
I have. So in Ogilvy, I came from Ogilvy, Sydney originally. So I was what's known as a planner in advertising. It's one of these amazing jobs that you never learn about in school, but once you sort of get into it, you realize, why did I waste all this time trying to sort of learn to be a planner? So if anyone's listening and need to learn more about advertising, the role of a planner is a spectacular one. So I was a planner in Ogilvy in Australia, and then sort of was asked to bring the world of behavioral science more explicitly into our business. Being a psychologist myself, then had a chance to spend some time with the team in the UK. So Rory Sutherland and Jez Groom founded the business in the UK in 2012, and had some time sort of with the team, and came over sort of by the time this is aired, maybe 6 years ago, and have loved being sort of what might be considered sort of a more sort of headquartered element of behavioural science within Ogilvy out of the London team.
That's awesome. And of course, Ogilvy, especially now, very well known for its work in behavioral science. Of course, because of Rory, Jez has been on the show as well, but with Nudge Stock, and I dedicated some space to Nudge Stock in my book, which I was writing when, just in the beginning days of pandemic, and watching Nudge Stock go from this, I forget now but where it became the Live Aid of, so from Woodstock of behavioral science to like, how can we be the Live Aid of behavioral science? And that, like I was saying in there, is just because something is changed doesn't mean it has to be worse. Virtual doesn't have to mean worse, is this little piece I put in my book about it. And how watching so many other people putting on conferences, a lot of things I was supposed to speak at, I'm sure you had the same experience in 2020, like many people did, where conferences would say, well, this year's a write-off. Nobody's going to want to pay for this. We'll just do this kind of crappy version online this year, limp along, and then hope we'll get something like we really want next year. And Nudge Stock took a different approach, right? Saying looking at what we have available to us, how could we make this the best it could possibly be? Are you able to share a little bit about kind of internal conversations about how you all thought about Nudge Stock differently and made that transition in 2020?
Of course. And first, I'm pleased the analogy from Woodstock to Live Aid is, I've presented those very slides to our CEO as we sort of spoke about the shift. So I'm pleased that sort of came through, and it was really, I think it was about a 10-week decision coming up to June in 2020, where we were planning on, normally for those that have not come across Nudge Stock, it's a festival that will be in our 10th year in 2022. And we typically hold it sort of in person by the seaside. It's a good excuse to get people out of the city of London to think differently. And we've hosted sort of several in Folkestone, sort of 450 people, being sort of a packed audience, and it's been wonderful. And obviously with the pandemic, that wasn't hard, and we were sort of in a fork in the road to as you say, to delay or to pivot. And I think at the time I was actually in Australia, so I moved back to Australia in March 2020, just because of some difficulties with childcare, working sort of full time, and could do with some grandparental support. But being in Australia and living sort of digitally, we thought, well, if we're going to do it, let's do it big, and let's use this year as the year to expose the rest of the planet to something that we've sort of celebrated locally in the UK for so long. Given I'm in Australia, Rory and team are in the UK, and Chris Graves, who's the founder of the Ogilvy Centre for Behavioural Science out of the US, we can literally follow the sun. So we started in Sydney, and we ended up, I think, with BJ Fogg in Hawaii for a bit of a sort of a long-term festival, and it was wonderful. It was, wonderful. I say wonderful in the sense that we were just gobsmacked by the generosity of our speakers, the willingness of attendees to come and build ideas, and it's sort of really changed, obviously, the proposition for Nudge Stock. And again, we did it in 2021. This time with a bit more than 10 weeks to plan. I was sort of joking that I was on a camping table in the basement of my partner's sort of family home for 2020, and I was in this live studio in London for 2021. So it has shifted, but it's been one of those instances where catastrophe can open up a space that we otherwise wouldn't have considered. It's a bit like sort of the story of the London Underground. Every time a line goes down, a large proportion of people find a better way to get to work.
Right.
And I think we found that with Nudge Stock.
Right. We kind of get out of our habits and the way that we've always done something, and find a new option. And from that first year, where I know that some in the 30,000 people that pre-registered to attend, but as far as views was over 128,000, I think. Is that?
In the first year, so we went through LinkedIn Live. So LinkedIn Live, and this was a way in which also, if you're going to do it, let's go big. And Ogilvy has about 1 million subscribers on LinkedIn. So we were able to push live throughout the LinkedIn channel. So we've got a lot of sort of organic traction. But we got, I think, 35,000 registrations, and obviously lots of organic views on the day. And what's also interesting for us, because there's a lot of content that we develop over this day. So the long tail of interaction is also really interesting. So there's for listeners who've not come across the nudge stock proposition, have a YouTube. You'll see sort of several years worth of nudge stock, be it Folkestone all the way through to sort of the more digital universe of nudge stock. So there's great content available. So that's sort of a key learning for us, this long tail.
Well, and I know I was watching in that first year and all the Twitter shout outs. And then there was this kind of like web of top connectors that I believe you had tweeted, which I was one of many people that was on that list, but it was exciting to see that. And then, the Behavioral Science Club on LinkedIn growing out of that, of which Louise has been a guest on the show before, talking about how great that was. So just to show, and for everyone, when things are open again, when there is, if you ever go back to doing this small, 450 people option, I can't even imagine what sort of lottery world you'll have to enter for people to be able to go, because everybody will, I know I would want to go. It's showing what an amazing event it could be. And Ogilvy has risen in a way that everybody else just sort of, like by, twiddling thumbs and hanging out, waiting for the next opportunity. You made your own space, which is such a cool thing to see, and something all sorts of businesses can do if you just look at those challenges like opportunities.
Yes. No, wonderful. That's thrilled to sort of hear you say that. And obviously a big effort every year. It's sort of a team of psychologists that create a TV program for a day.
Yeah.
So it's certainly a team effort, but we are immensely proud of it. So I appreciate it that it's landing for people outside our walls.
Yeah, absolutely. And a TV show created by psychologists sounds like my kind of show. So we'll tune in again. All right. Well, let's at least talk a little bit about your book. I guess that's why you're here, which, so we're talking far in advance, but this episode is going to be coming out right when the book comes out. And it's called Evolutionary Ideas. And one of the things I love, and so I was kind of gushing at you when we first started chatting. So, but I love that I'm learning so much about other things. It's kind of like Planet Earth meets behavioral science, or I guess you guys have David Attenborough. I don't know if you do the Planet Earth thing around the other places, if they have that as common. But this approach where I'm learning about different things about animals I didn't necessarily know and how that ties in. And I'm curious, an organizational psychologist who works in advertising, how did you even decide that this was what the book was going to be? Did it kind of happen along the way, or you've had this kind of side interest in animals that turned into, kind of what happened?
A good question. So the beginnings of the book, I think, actually started in about 2014, when I was asked to do a keynote in Sydney. Adam Ferry runs a conference called Marketing Science Ideas Exchange. And I've always been fascinated in how sort of these organic examples of behavioral science are all around us. And from what I get most excited by is sort of how we can be more creative as a result of the field of behavioral science. And actually, for me, the secret weapon are these sort of these nudges in the wild, these examples of manifestations of applied behavioral science that we otherwise wouldn't consider in a textbook. I also think that's a bit of my responsibility, being sort of a little bit different as a practitioner, but as a practitioner in an advertising agency, that I sort of can stretch it as far as I possibly can. And hopefully this isn't too long a story out. But when I was asked to sort of speak, they asked me, Sam, what music would you like played when you go on stage on the conference? And I actually asked for Jimi Hendrix playing the Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock. And the reason that song's so important is that it was sort of obviously a tried and tested pattern of notes and chords and a song that was very well known. But it was what made it famous was that he infused it from inspiration of the world around us. That's sort of the drums dropping in Vietnam War and the sounds of helicopters overhead. And that's what made it sort of truly special. So that the story for this keynote was about sort of learning the chords, being inspired by nature and then sort of jamming to make something completely sort of unique. And that's where I think sort of the central idea actually came from. And then probably 6 years later, I was shared a video about biomimicry. And biomimicry, I speak about it in the book, is a field that seeks to borrow from the natural world to solve distinctively human challenges. So it's the assumption that if it's around today, it's survived sort of 3.8 billion years of research and development. So there's got to be something good about it. So rather than just being sort of inspired by nature and be like, well, there's natural stuff all around us, let's bring it into the hot pot. It's actually thinking about these aren't just sort of natural, these are adapted solutions. Right? And just as you can borrow from, and I write in the book, from a kingfisher's bill to the nose of a speed train, you can also borrow from adapted psychological solutions to solve distinctively human challenges. And that was the piece where I thought, there's something in here about using this analogy to help us to explore the realm of possibility in applied behavioral science.
Right. And it's such an interesting read, where you're talking about vampire bats in another part of the book, and that if they miss 2 meals, they will die. And so the others in the group, the herd, for lack of a better, or for the behavioral term, right, will then give some of their food in a really gross way, but they help sustain those who missed a meal to make sure that everyone can survive. You have to give back this reciprocity piece. And essentially, if you ever were going to be a hoarder of your food and be thinking just about yourself, you get shunned, and then, too bad for you. You're kind of off on your own. So the comparisons, I think, are really valuable in understanding that we're not alone in the way that we've adapted. But why talk about vampire bats when you're talking about reciprocity and, how that applies for people?
For me, you're right in the sense that we're not distinct. And so I think appreciating this behavior on a continuum, and there are leaps in logic, and as you're sort of trying to explore, this is a chapter about trust that you mentioned with the vampire bats, a key sort of area of contradiction that I can explore a little bit later. But I think it sort of helps us to bring a new lens on theory that some of us might be familiar with, and to view it on a continuum as to what's the positive role that this behavior has played in our survival. Therefore, why would there be solutions around us that have adapted to make that easier? Because that's really sort of, I think the line is sort of regurgitate first, ask questions later. sort of the payoff there. And just as that behavior is common for the vampire bat, there are many sort of signals and cues and actions that are important for us to maintain social well-being, to look at much of financial trade, everything's sort of built off trust. So if we can start with something that is as concrete and tangible as a vampire bat, then we can help us to go to sort of maybe less concrete psychological solutions in the future, because actually that's sort of one of the areas when we look at biological solutions, we tend to be able to see them. And increasingly see them with technology and microscopes, right? But you can see them more easily. It's psychological solutions that have been harder to see. So being able to sort of liken the dorsal fin to an asymmetric decoy is kind of an interesting challenge, because as soon as I say dorsal fin, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But an asymmetric decoy is a little bit more obscure. So being able to sort of actually tread this line between sort of how it's evolved in nature or in technology as well, we talk a lot about evolution and technical solutions, helps us to sort of be more open and see psychological solutions in a slightly different way, I think.
Yeah. I had made a note. One of the things I thought was really interesting. So, and you talk about, having a word for banana, so you don't have to go through this long terminology of it's yellow and angled and slippery and whatever. But then tying that into different languages that have multiple words for shades of blue, like a light blue and a dark blue, where in, English, blue is just blue. And to me, and this gets into, perhaps it's because I'm doing so much in a change management sort of space right now, but just because you don't have a word for something, just because you don't see something doesn't mean it's not there and that it wouldn't resonate for someone else. And like the first thing that you see or missing something, doesn't mean it's not there. So taking the time to like dig a little bit deeper, someone next to you might be seeing these, a big transition, some huge shift that happened that you completely missed. And it's just because you weren't programmed with the same words early on. Do you want to expand on any of that?
Of course. And I think in that instance, it can be labeling the change in ways that help people see that they're categorically different. So the chapter of the book, I talk a lot about language. And as you're right, and having a concept, the word banana opens up a rich array of associated links, whether it's touch, smell, all these other sort of attributes that can be housed really efficiently through the word banana. So language is sort of immensely powerful, not just in sort of processing, but it helps us to actually see different things in the world. It helps us to categorically differentiate between concepts. And that's why looking at color is really interesting, because in color, we use sort of universally shared physiology, but we have different language. So in Greek and Russian, as you say, they've got two different words, categories for light blue and dark blue. In English, it's both blue. And you put people in a brain scanner and you find that actually it's not just this tricky spectrum. People who have different terms can react faster. They can see a categorical difference. And the reason I sort of go on a little bit of a deep dive on language is that it helps to justify what can be criticism to behavioral science in some fields. But it's just a complicated way of describing these sort of assumed truths. It's like we sort of know this. What does it add? It's like we sort of get it in retrospect. But the reason I think it's really important is that once you have a language for something, then you see it more frequently, more easily. And if you can start to see these things more frequently and easily, then you can apply them more systematically. We don't just sort of stumble across these solutions. We create this diagnostic framework, and Kahneman talks about this a lot. I mean, the richer our vernacular of diagnosis, the richer our solutions can be. But it helps us to more easily spot these specimens. And so now we know this concept of asymmetric decoy. We can see it actually in spaces that you wouldn't expect. We don't have to look at a paper. We don't have to go back to the economist example. There are actually multiple different variants of an asymmetric decoy once you know what you're looking for. But without the language, that becomes much, much, much tougher. So I think language is a real unlocker here.
Right. And the language that we've used for an asymmetric decoy here is there's an episode on relativity, because that's an easier one. And which is also where I don't like to say hyperbolic time discounting, because that's not something that's easy for people to remember typically. I talk about the I'll start Monday effect.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah.
And sometimes people walk into rooms like, here we go, they're going to throw out a couple of sort of complex terms. And sometimes that's the case, but also these help us to connect worlds. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. If because of this language, you can view out of category. Right, you can say actually this is a what might be considered a more universal concept. We're going to talk a lot about nothing's universal, right? And certainly in the close, we all know that context and individual differences still play a critical role. But if we can understand the concept of asymmetric decoy, that can help us to stretch across categories. Right? We can see examples of that across different species or industries. Which is why I bring up this concept and sort of the analogy of evolutionary processes suit this as well. In the animal kingdom, the dolphin and the shark have both convergently evolved to feature a dorsal fin, even though the shark is a fish and a dolphin is a mammal. They both sort of converged on the same solution. Once you know the dorsal fin, then you can navigate many other species the same way as we can do that with our language.
Right. And the reason that we do these things has been adapted, evolved over generations in, most all cases of reciprocity and herding and all the being loss averse and whatever, is there's some reason that this has stuck around, because the people who went another way kind of became a fossil, as you said, right? Like the birds that didn't have the right shape of a beak didn't survive. And so they phased out, versus, so what we see today really has had, millions, billions, whatever years of testing to get to this point, and knowing that we can then embrace that it's not just the dolphin, because and sharks have it too. So there must be a reason. And then what can we be learning from that in whatever we are doing now, which I think is a really great transition to both the innovation myths that are in the book. And then you have these kind of 5 segments of the areas, which I know we don't have time to get into all of them. And that's what the book is for. People will buy the book to get all of this. But your innovation myths, that big problems need big solutions, not true. And also that we feel like new problems need new solutions. So we've talked quite a bit already on the new problems, new solutions. I always like to kind of choose your own adventure with guests here, to where I'm kind of teeing this up for you. And you may go however you choose to talk about this at this point. But I love the innovation myths. I love how, you talk about that in the 5 categories, throughout the book. I have now said things, and you may say things.
I can take no, so the innovation myths, I think, are really important, because one element that I hope that the book adds to society is this assumption that we don't always need to be revolutionary doing. That's sort of where the title Evolutionary Ideas comes from. We have an assumption that we need to sort of, and this appetite and this fetish for big, bold, game-changing ideas. And even more so when we're faced with a big problem or a novel problem. And I wrote a bit at the beginning of the book about sort of proportionality. We have this intrinsic sense of big problems need big ideas, novel problems need novel ideas, just as if you assume that a loud bang needed a loud force by which to create it. I mean, we have this sort of mechanical mindset. And we bring that into innovation, and I think that's what I want to challenge. And there's been much written on small ideas with big impacts, particularly in our category. So that's there's many great books that go deep into sort of butterfly effects and small changes that make big differences. So I don't go into more detail there, but the majority is around this sort of novel problems need novel solutions. And actually, if we can identify that we have a series of shared problems that we face. And as a result of the shared nature of these problems, we've also evolved or adapted to have shared solutions. And my contention is that we just haven't been able to see them or organize those patterns of solutions in a useful way until sort of the progression of contemporary behavioral science. And there's a midway point, if I can sort of, so there's 3 sort of key tools in setting up the book. And the first is the field of biomimicry that we've touched upon, which is sort of borrowing from an evolved sort of biological solutions. There's another framework that I referenced called TRIZ, which is really fascinating. And this is sort of an area that I've learned writing the book. It's essentially sort of an engineering solution looking at patterns of evolved technical solutions. So just as you can have the shared solution of the dorsal fin, there are many different patterns of engineering solutions that exist around us. And rather than millions of years of evolved biology, it's thousands of engineers looking to solve problems in new and novel ways and converging on the ones that work. There's a lovely quote. I think it's the sea herself who fashions the boats. So because of this investment of time to help to solve problems with many different thinkers over many different years, we just find these patterns. And TRIZ is a really big unlocker for that, because TRIZ, I think, identifies a suite of inventive principles to help to solve engineering problems. So if you're looking to increase the length of an item without increasing its volume, for example, you need a pattern of solutions called nesting doll. Right? So there's a suite of inventive principles. Just as in behavioral science, we might have a suite of psychological or behavioral principles. So that's another sort of unlocker. And so the reason I bring out TRIZ, though, because you mentioned some of the 5 chapters in the book that look at trust and decision-making and action, loyalty and experience. An unlocker for me on the journey of writing a book this book was the discovery of TRIZ. And in TRIZ, there's a sort of a belief that innovation is the resolution of a contradiction. So how can I make a Kevlar jacket strong enough to stop a bullet, yet light enough to wear? Those sort of opposing forces require innovation to solve. How can I create an umbrella that's big enough to cover the human body, but small enough to fit in a handbag? That requires a degree of innovation by which to solve it. And to help solve that, TRIZ has a beautiful matrix that helps us. But in our world, we have a suite of psychological contradictions. So how can we sort of boost perceptions of trust without changing the truth? So we don't necessarily need to make things up to boost trustworthiness. Actually, these cues and signals are there. We just need to understand them and elevate them. How can we aid decision-making without limiting choice? And it's sort of a classic choice architecture conundrum. How can we trigger action without forcing a response? Increase loyalty without sort of resorting to compensation as a first, and boost experience and improve experience without changing duration. So we find that these now sort of powerful psychological contradictions. And I think by repackaging these contradictions, then we more easily see that we're all faced with these shared problems in boosting trust, in aiding decision-making, in triggering action, in reinforcing loyalty, in improving experiences. If that's part of your business, that will be part of many of our day. Then someone is likely faced with a similar problem to you, although you might be selling pizzas and they're selling supercars. But if you understand what connects us, again, these inventive principles or psychological principles, then you can borrow from each other and learn together.
Absolutely. And was a perfect segue, as this is the Brainy Business, and we have lots of people in business listening. And of course, with your work in Ogilvy is at on a business side. Wow. So for someone that is in their job that's listening and thinking about how they want to go applying some of this, what do you think is the best place for someone to start? In addition to so they've bought your book, and what's next, right?
I think, the nice thing about our work is that there are always opportunities to employ it. I think whether you're looking at getting more people to attend a meeting and you send out an A/B email with different strategies. There are always ways in which we can experiment. So I think the more we know, the better we become, I think, by working to hopefully convert what can be complex theory into more straightforward provocation, I think is helpful. So you don't need to necessarily know the ins and outs of prospect theory to understand how might we make it feel like you might miss out on this opportunity if you don't act now. For example, that's sort of a way in which we can deploy complex theory in more pragmatic ways, without sort of. I know that the team would like. You've spoken to many fantastic authors whose texts and books would be wonderful as a way of passage for others. But I think, back to Jimi Hendrix, understand that the notes and chords, familiarize ourselves with these patterns of our psychology, and they are patterns of observations, but by codifying these patterns of observations, we make it easier for us to navigate. Again, as you say, it's different to sort of a long, bent, slippery morning staple. It's like a banana.
Right.
And if we're making a behavior change is like making a fruit salad, and it's easier to say add the banana than the other. So learning the notes and chords, the frameworks handed down by the masters, if I go back to sort of where this started with Jimi Hendrix, then we can start to deploy them more easily. And once we sort of get more confident, and Jimmy mastered the A's, B's, C's, and D's and moved into, okay, how do I splice this reverberator so it sounds like a helicopter? Then you can start to sort of mix it up. And to mix it up, there's a rich and vast resource of inspiration in the world around us, not just in textbooks or studies, but it's happening all around us every day. And once you know what you're looking for, once you're armed with this vernacular, then I challenge you not to see it. It becomes a bit of an affliction. But if you can see it in novel ways, then you can apply it creatively. I think that was a long answer to your question. Hopefully it sounds straightforward enough to start off, but I think know the standard notes and chords, and then you can begin to riff and make it your own.
Right. Yeah. I think that you likely, like I was saying, I could tell in reading your book, we are kindred and have good, similar thought processes on things. And that I end every episode of the show by saying, be thoughtful. And I close off my emails that way. And also in the book, I talk about becoming a curious questioner and how that goes with being thoughtful. And I would assume that you maybe have a similar, walking through an airport, let's say. I'm one where I'm always stopping, like, oh gosh, I just need to take a picture of this because I have a thought about how this ties into whatever. And sometimes it's the way that the holiday display is set up, or what an interesting way they did this. Maybe it's an ad. It could be anything, and totally unrelated. And where, with clients where they'll say, oh, well, have you worked with people in X industry? And even if the answer is no, the brain makes decisions the same way, regardless, what we're looking at. It doesn't really matter. And like you're saying, even humans are much like other animals. We can look at inspiration in all these other places, even if you don't have this specific background. If you have some common knowledge and, like you said, that the terminology of behavioral science, if that's what you're going to be building your business around and being able to implement some of this, not to say that you're in the behavioral science business, but you're looking at solving problems in this way, then having that common language is really important, so you can have a solid conversation and then can look about how you can do things a little bit differently using things that are known. Completely agree. And it can be reframing the category that we're in. And that's where some of the sort of the advocates of biomimicry and why they found it to be such an unlocker in design and architecture, it just sort of forces a complete change of reference. So if we have a partner that's looking at, let's think about sort of a financial sector, for example, and there's a specific question about, actually, we don't have any direct cases on that specific subcomponent of finance, but I suspect that trust has a lot to do with it. And actually, if you look at trust with this specific widget, let's call it, then there's a lot of actually shared learning if we look at it through the lens of trust. Actually, that's where we've got oodles of experience that can be deployed in this how you would categorize the nature of your problem. So by recategorizing the problem, rather than being it's just my problem in this part of this vertical that only we face because we've got this specific XYZ that's related to our industry. It's like, no, if you can reframe it in more human terms, then solutions are all around us to help us to solve that. And that's where I think that's a big piece. So if we can help us to sort of step back and not assume that it's category specific, but I understand from a behavioural perspective what we're challenged with, then we'll find that actually you're probably not as unique in facing your challenges as you might think you are. It goes back to the proportionality bias again. Right. Which should be comforting that, like you say in there, someone has solved this problem before. And so if you don't come to it thinking, oh man, this can never be done, I can't think of a specific example right now, but, or even where people would say you can't run a mile in less than whatever time, or this cannot be done. You can't do it. And then someone does it and then everyone does it, right? Yeah. That once you know it can be done, then you can do it too. And so having that, this has been solved somewhere, whether it's by humans or elsewhere, I know that something has tackled this and I just have to find it and get that kind of adaptation on something that can inspire a solution, I think should be hopefully an empowering message for everyone. I hope so. And one of the elements that's been sort of important for my learning ongoing in my career is around sort of how questions can be real unlockers. So part of the book is exploring sort of the concept of systematic creativity and how sort of questions can be really helpful for us to have a bit more of a checklist approach to creativity. And sometimes that might feel binary opposed to creativity, but at least being armed with a bit of a safety blanket of some questions that you can ask. They won't always be relevant, but all you need is one or two. So you just need one idea here. So by having a couple of spaces to look into that you otherwise wouldn't, and the vernacular of behavioral science and the sort of adapted psychological solutions around us create a really rich collection of different questions that we can ask.
They won't all be relevant, but you just need one. So if you think of your sort of recategorize the nature of your problem that's specific to me, specific to my category, to actually shared by many, with solutions likely existing, albeit applied in another category, abstracting that through a question and redeploying it yourself, hopefully there's a good sort of checklist for us to take away here.
Yeah, absolutely. The audience knows that I love me some good questions. I do a lot of training on question storming instead of brainstorming with businesses, as it is my favorite thing to do. And I do want to be thoughtful of your time. As I said, could sit and chat forever, but as we have to close out the show, what is the best way for everyone who is excited to go get their copy of Evolutionary Ideas and to connect with you and or Ogilvy or whatever it is? What's the best next steps for them to take?
I mean, firstly, big thanks for having me on. Lovely to be able to have this conversation about the book, and thank you for supporting it. So the book's available on Amazon. So Evolutionary Ideas be available on Amazon. I'm available on LinkedIn, or my email, sam.tatam@ogilvy.com. Any questions, do shout. But I hope I've learned a lot through the process of writing this book. Melina, you described it when we were sort of speaking before around sort of learning lots in the process of uncovering something we're familiar with. And I think that's been a journey that's been familiar to me too. So I do hope this book adds something to the world by which we can be more efficient in our problem solving, and hopefully individually ask slightly different questions when faced with challenges that we feel that we're alone in, and knowing that actually others have faced this and solved it, and the answers all around us.
Wonderful. Well, we'll definitely have links for the book, for your LinkedIn. I know that you're pretty active on Twitter, so we'll do that as well. I do not put guest emails typed out in the show notes because I care about your inbox and not getting spammed. So for listeners here, you can go back 20 seconds, write it down, and know that it won't be there for people that check out the show notes. So that's a little bonus for listening. So thank you again, Sam, for joining me on the show, for your amazing book. It's been a delight to chat with you today.
Thank you so much. The pleasure's mine.
Thank you again to Sam Tatam for joining me on the show today. What got your brain buzzing in today's conversation? I truly loved this book, and I think you will too. Even for me, where I know most of the baseline concepts really well and am familiar with a lot of the behavioral science related studies, there was so much I learned about other species throughout the book that was so interesting. Every moment, I felt like I was learning something cool that could be a great tidbit for sharing at a cocktail party. I'll be sure to let John Levy know there is a treasure trove of little conversational anecdotes his guests will be able to pull from at future events. So there are lots of things I love from this book, including a new version of not inventing the wheel and knowing that any problem you have has already been solved before. To reframe the problem from being some sort of obstacle that's brand new and that you have to start from scratch and it's, this terribly overwhelming thing, to just searching for where it's already been done and solved by another species or somewhere else, is a really cool approach that I think can help a lot of people to solve their problems in innovative ways. I also really love the way he talks about the value of shared language. I cite Evolutionary Ideas and Sam in my upcoming book, What Your Employees Need and Can't Tell You, which is slated to come out this fall. And the example of how when you have to ask people for the long, bent, yellow, slippery morning staple every time we make breakfast or a fruit salad would take so much longer and be so much more confusing than just saying banana. That is a big part of the work I do here at the Brainy Business on the podcast and in corporate trainings and in the books I write. It's about helping people to understand the concepts of behavioral economics and have that common language to be further down the path of getting things done. If you have to try and explain the underlying idea of a concept that you think might exist, but you don't really have a name for, to someone every time you want to make a point, it's so much less efficient and more difficult than saying, are we bike shedding here? Or did we set the right anchor? Or where can we incorporate a prime? Having a common language is so valuable, and just one of the amazingly helpful insights you'll get from Sam's book, Evolutionary Ideas. There are links to get your own copy in the show notes for the episode, along with ways to connect with Sam, see related past episodes and books, and so much more. It's all waiting for you within the app you're listening to or at thebrainybusiness.com/204. And please do find us both on Twitter, tag us, let us know how much you loved the insights from the episode. Once you get your copy of the book, which, like I said, came out this week, being able to share about that. I am the Brainy Biz, and Sam is S_Tatam, TATAM. And we would love to chat with you there on Twitter. Give some love to Evolutionary Ideas and Sam, and we very much look forward to chatting with you there. And if you enjoy the experience I've provided here for you, will you share about it? That could mean leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen, sharing this episode or any other with a friend who you think would find value in the insights, or even hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate it. And you. Thank you again to Sam Tatam for joining me on the show today. It was a delight to chat with and learn from you. Join me next week for another brainy episode of the Brainy Business Podcast. It's going to be a lot of fun. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Melina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.